Today, we will learn and reflect on the history behind the Battle of Salamis in the Greco-Persian Wars, where the heavily outnumbered Greek fleet decisively defeated and destroyed much of the Persian fleet while the great Persian King Xerxes watched in horror. The playwright Aeschylus fought in the Greco-Persian Wars, and the battle scenes in his play The Persians may have been eyewitness accounts and provide a much more enthralling and possibly more accurate version of the battle than that which we read in Herodotus. But we'll also consult Herodotus. He has some interesting anecdotes and stories about the colorful lady General Artemisia, who sort of fought for the Persians in her trireme. Herodotus tells us that he wrote his history so that human achievements may not be forgotten in time, and great and marvelous deeds, some displayed by Greeks, and some by barbarians, may not be without their glory, and especially to show why the two peoples fought with each other. At the end of our talk, we'll discuss the sources we used for this video and some additional lessons we can learn from these sources in my blogs that cover the topic. Please, we welcome interesting questions in the comments. Let us learn and reflect together. We pondered in our first video, as in the Iliad, just how the Greek soldiers and sailors in the histories of Herodotus fight for kleos, or glory, and warriors in these warrior societies are immortalized by the great and marvelous deeds on the battlefield. Now, in the first 4 books of his histories, Herodotus treats us to a tour and snippets of the histories of Persia and its conflicts with Scythia and Egypt. In our second video, Herodotus recounts the history of the Greco-Persian Wars, including his version of the Battle of Salamis. Now, the above videos have more extensive introductory information, so let us summarize the ancient ships of war. In the Greek Navy, the triremes had 3 long stacked rows of rowers who had to row in unison, with a heavy ram below the waterline in the front of the ship, with which they'd ram the opponents and try and sink him. A typical trireme had about 170 rowers, plus a handful of hoplite infantry ready on deck. Whether or not they were successful in sinking the opposing ship, this hoplite contingent was ready to board the opposing ships and do hand-to-hand combat. Now, Greek navies of triremes were fighting on both the Greek and the Persian side, and references in Herodotus state that it was difficult to tell them apart in the thick of battle. Now, Herodotus is best when he repeats anecdotes or interesting stories, but his descriptions of the important battles sometimes fall short. But the Greek playwright Aeschylus includes an emotional memory of the naval battle of Salamis, where the outnumbered Greek fleet sinks a large portion of the mighty Persian fleet. In the last Greco-Persian War, King Xerxes had an enormous army marching towards Greece along the coast from Persia. Herodotus says there were over 2 million soldiers marching, but modern scholars accuse Herodotus of exaggerating the size of the army to a vast extent. It would have been difficult in the ancient world to feed an army of 100,000 or 200,000 on the march. The vast Persian fleet sailed along the coast as the army marched. Now, one of the Persian commanders Xerxes admired was the Greek Artemisia, and she was the only woman commander on either side of the war. Artemisia's husband was the tyrant of the Persian satrapy of Caria, and when he died, she became the ruling tyrant, and she was commanding a trireme from Caria. Her son could have commanded the trireme, but she instead sailed with the fleet, as Herodotus says. Her own spirit of adventure and manly courage were her only incentives. And this tyrantessa Artemisia will figure prominently in the Battle of Salamis. As we learned in our video in the Greco-Persian War, the Greek strategy was for the Spartan and Greek hoplites to stop the Persian army north of Athens at the Pass of Thermopylae, and for the Athenian and Greek triremes to stop the Persian navy at the Straits of Salamis. The force of several thousand hoplites stopped the Persian army dead in its track when defending the narrow Pass of Thermopylae for many days, causing massive Persian casualties. But when a traitor revealed a mountain path that avoided the pass, the Persians were able to attack from both sides. The Spartan commander, Leonidas, knew that they were doomed, so he sent most of the Confederate troops home, leaving a mostly Spartan force of the famous 300 behind, who fought to the death. And the movie about this event, 300, by the way, has many historical inaccuracies. And this noble story Herodotus narrates in livid detail in our main video on the Greco-Persian Wars. The decision was made to abandon Athens, as the Athenians could not prevent the city from falling under a Persian siege. The Athenian men would board their triremes, while the women, children, and slaves would be sent as temporary refugees to the nearby Peloponnese city-state of Troezen and also the island of Salamis, taking whatever property with them that they could, leaving Athens nearly deserted. The Persians lost no time in invading Attica and the nearly empty city of Athens, looting and burning Athens and all her temples. But booty of another kind was not to be found. No concubines could be seized, as the women and children had left. Should the Persians attack the Athenian fleet at Salamis? Our tyrantessa Artemisia, alone among the Persians, disagreed with General Mardonius, counseling that the Persians should not rush to attack the Greek at Salamis. And she says, "The Greeks are as far superior to your men in naval matters as men are to women. In any case, what pressing need do you have to risk further action at sea? Have you not taken Athens, the main objective of the war? Is the rest of Greece not in your power? If you merely keep your fleet where it is now, you can stay here or advance into the Peloponnese, and you will easily accomplish your purpose." Now, once the tides of war had shifted to the Greeks, later on, the Spartans' noble stand at Thermopylae, like the Alamo, would inspire them in their battles with the Persians, and would inspire historians over the centuries and the millennia. But the effect on the Greeks the day after the battle was despairing. Some Greeks were wanting to sail their triremes to the Isthmus to defend the Spartan lands of the Peloponnese. Now, Themistocles grasped that the best chance for the Greeks to prevail would be to fight in the cramped straits of Salamis. He addressed the Greek sailors and troops. "It is now in your power to save Greece, if you take my advice and engage the enemy's fleet here in Salamis." And he details his plan. "First, we shall be fighting in narrow waters, and there, with our inferior numbers, we shall win. Fighting in a confined space favors us, but fighting in the open sea favors the enemy. Second, Salamis, where we have put our women and children, will be preserved. And third, you will be fighting in the defense of the Peloponnese by remaining here just as much as withdrawing to the Isthmus." Now, Themistocles wanted to be sure that the Greeks would face the Persians in the cramped straits of Salamis. So Themistocles sent his slave to furtively visit the Persian camp to give a message to the commander, so they would that night bottle up the Greek fleet in Salamis, so they could not escape. Herodotus repeats this message for us. "I am the bearer of a secret communication from the Athenian commander, who is a well-wisher to your king and hopes for a Persian victory. He has told me to report to you that the Greeks are afraid and are planning to slip away. Only prevent them from slipping from your fingers, and you have at this moment an opportunity of unparalleled success." Now, the Persians were known for hiring their former Greek enemies as advisors, so Themistocles was assuring his personal success no matter who won the Battle of Salamis. And indeed, later in life, the Athenians set him in exile, and we read in Plutarch that Themistocles ruled a Greek city in Persia as a benign tyrant for many years. And also he had kind of ruined his reputation because he was guilty of accepting a bribe here and there. But in the play of Aeschylus, a messenger is given Queen Atossa, widow of Darius, mother of Xerxes, an emotional eyewitness account of the naval battle of Salamis. And while we read the excerpts from the play of Aeschylus, the Persians, we also want to remind you that this was written from the point of view of the Persians. However, whenever he refers to barbarian, he's referring to the Persian fleet because, well, you can never call Greeks barbarians. "Our crews then, with no lack of order but with an obedient spirit, prepared their evening meal, while each sailor looped his oar about his thole-pin so it fitted well. But when the light of the sun had faded and the night drew on, each master of an oar and each man versed in arms went on board. The long Persian galleys cheered each other line by line, and they held their course as each captain had been ordered. And all through the night the commanders of the fleet kept their whole force cruising to and fro across the strait. Night began to wane, yet the fleet of the Hellenes in no way attempted to put forth by stealth." Here we witness the brilliant tactics of Themistocles, for the Greek naval forces had the benefit of a sound night's sleep and a good breakfast, while the Persian sailors spent their night before the big battle bobbing up and down on the waves, bottling up the Greeks, and not getting a wink of sleep. Now, can you imagine pulling an all-nighter, then having to row and fight all day with little to eat and drink under the bright hot sun? Now, with horror, the dog-tired Persians greet both the dawn and the battle cries of the Greeks. And Aeschylus remembers, "When radiant day with her white horses shone all over the land, a loud cheer like a song of triumph first rang out from the Hellenes, and at the same instant, clear from the island crags, An echo returned an answering cry. Terror fell upon the barbarians, balked of their purpose. For then the Hellenes chanted their solemn paean, not as in flight, but as men rushing to the onset with the courage of gallant hearts. The trumpets with its blast set their side afire, and instantly at the word of command, with even stroke of foaming oars, the Greeks struck the briny deep. Swiftly they all came clear into view. The right wing, well marshaled, led on an orderly advance. Next their whole army pressed on against us, and at the same time a loud shout met our ears. On, you men of Hellas, free your native land, free your children, your wives, the temples of your fathers' gods, and the tombs of your ancestors. Now you are fighting for all you have. And then from our side rose in response the mingled clamor of Persian speech, and straightway the ships dashed together their bronze prows. It was a ship of Hellas that began the charge, and chopped off in its entirety the curved stem of a Phoenician boat. Each captain drove his ship straight against some other ship. At first the stream of the Persian army held its own, when the mass of our ships had been crowded in the narrows, and none could render another aid, and each crashed its bronze prow against each other of its own line. They splintered their whole bank of oars. Then the Hellenic galleys, not heedless of their chance, hemmed them in and battered them on every side, and the sea was hidden from our sight, strewn as it was with wrecks and slaughtered men. The shores and reefs were crowded with our dead, and every ship that formed a part of the barbarian fleet plied its oars in disorderly flight. But as if our men were tuna or some haul of fish, the foe kept striking and hacking them with broken oars and fragments of wrecked ships. Groans and shrieks together filled the open sea until the face of black night hid the scene. But as for the full extent of our disasters, this, even if I had 10 days in succession to do so, I could not describe to you. However, you can be sure that so great a multitude of men never perished in a single day. Herodotus tells us how Artemisia dealt with the excessive chaos in the battlefield. After the Persian fleet had lost all semblance of order, Artemisia was chased by an Athenian trireme. As her ship happened to be the closest to the enemy and there were other friendly ships just ahead of her, escape was impossible. In this awkward situation, she hit upon a plan which turned out greatly to her advantage. With the Athenian close on her tail, she drove ahead with all possible speed and rammed a friendly ship. Whether she had a quarrel with the captain of that ship, or it was just in the way, is hard to say. But in any case, Herodotus tells us, she rammed and sank her, and was lucky enough to reap a double benefit. For the captain of the Athenian trireme, on seeing her ram an enemy, naturally assumed her ship was a Greek ship, or at least a deserter fighting on the Greek side, so he abandoned the chase and turned to attack elsewhere. Now Xerxes was watching, and a bystander commented, "Do you see, my lord, how well Artemisia is fighting? She has sunk an enemy ship." To which Xerxes responded, "My men have turned into women, and my women into men." And Artemisia was indeed lucky. There were no survivors to accuse her. Now King Xerxes was concerned that the Greek fleet would sail to the Hellespont and destroy his bridges, so he started making plans for his escape. This General Mardonius said they should blame those Confederates who were manning the ships, the Egyptians, the Phoenicians, the Cyprians, the Cilicians, because the Persians were not involved in those losses. Mardonius tells Xerxes, "If you have made up your mind not to stay here, then go home together with the greater part of the army, and I will make it my duty with 300,000 picked troops to deliver Greece to you in chains." And this gave a way for Xerxes to return home without losing too much face. Artemisia advised Xerxes to accept this plan proposed by Mardonius. "Who cares if Mardonius comes to grief? He is only your slave, and the Greeks will have but a poor triumph if they kill him. As for yourself, you will be going home with the object of your campaign established, for you have burned Athens." And indeed, if you listened to the prior video, Mardonius did have a bad end. Eventually, the Greeks wiped out most of the remaining troops in Greece. And in Aeschylus' play, The Persians, the ghost of Darius, says this to the good Persian queen Atossa: "Wherefore instruct your lord, your son Xerxes, with well-reasoned admonitions teach him to have a humbler heart and cast away the sin of pride, for it offends God." And Aeschylus imagines what Xerxes may have said when he arrived home in Persia. "Ah, my fate is upon me, my star is declined, a grief has undone me, a doom none divined. Age, thine eyes chide me, they bow down my head, my strength is denied me, my limbs are as lead. Would Zeus that I had laid fallen in battle, covered up out of sight with the dead." Now, we do know that this was not the end of Xerxes, as he ruled for another decade and a half. Now, we'll talk about the sources we used for this video. The Histories of Herodotus are a joy to read, and the books that cover the Greco-Persian War reads more like a history with many entertaining stories, and we left some for you to discover. And we also recommend the Lives of the Famous Greeks and Romans by Plutarch, and he includes a history of Themistocles. Now, Herodotus is his main source, but he does contain some material that's not in Herodotus. We enjoyed reading the play by Aeschylus, but we noted that the 1922 online translation varied radically from the translation in this Britannica Great Books volume. There are other more recent translations listed in Wikipedia, but they have copyright issues, so I used the 1922 translation for the long battle scenes. But for the other verses, I prefer the Britannica translation, which tried to be more poetic, which sometimes worked and sometimes not. I also want to point out that you can pick up used copies of the individual volumes in this series used for a song. And we discussed the 2 great course lectures on Herodotus in our first video on the Histories of Herodotus. The YouTube description links to the video script and our blog. Please support our channel by sharing this video with your friends and by clicking on the like and subscribe buttons, and by clicking on the Amazon links to purchase any of the books we discussed, which will earn us a small affiliate commission. And please consider becoming a patron of our channel. And please click on the links for interesting videos on other topics that will broaden your knowledge and improve your soul. Thank you.